What is it about the story of two people who may or may not have witnessed a UFO, who or have witnessed something that they don't understand, who may or may not have been abducted by aliens? Uh, why is this story more a story that you see as representative of a bigger cultural moment rather than just like a weird thing that happened to two people one time?
That is a great question, and I want to say thank you to Tara for inviting me and all of you for attending. And let me set the stage a bit. So, Betty and Barney Hill were an interracial couple married in 1960, living in New Hampshire, who in September 1961 claimed that they saw a strange light in the sky. 3 years later, under hypnosis, they claimed that that light was piloted by extraterrestrials, that it landed on the road in front of them, took them into their craft, performed medical experiments on them, and then released them with no memory of that encounter. This was the first alien abduction in the modern sense of the phrase, right? With little men, gray skin, big eyes, medical experimentation, all of that stuff in American history. I came to this story in a somewhat roundabout path. I was interested in writing something about UFOs, and particularly how UFOs sort of represent a lot of the transformations happening in American religion in the last half of the 20th century, right? This kind of broad path away from institutional religions, away from the kind of traditional denominations towards the New Age. And I found Betty and Barney Hill after deciding that because their niece, Kathleen Marden, who's a great advocate for theirs, who believes that they were abducted, donated their papers to the University of New Hampshire about 10 years ago. And no academic had ever used their papers to write a book about the Hills before. So I was able to get into their letters, to read diaries, memoirs, all sorts of stuff. And I begin to see how the Hills, I think, are a microcosm not just of one story, that is this kind of small story of aliens in America and belief in UFOs in America, but rather their story encapsulates a lot of what was going on in mid 20th century America. They were deeply involved in the civil rights movement, and that story really bears upon their experience with aliens. They were part of this broad shift in American politics as well, away from this traditional New Deal coalition. A group of Americans who supported the welfare state that Franklin Roosevelt created in the 1930s that gradually became unraveled in the 1960s and 70s. The Hills were part of that migration as well. So there's a lot going on with these people. And as I thought about that, as I read their papers and saw the ways in which all of these stories are connected, it really brought something home to me, which is this. We think of UFOs and all the things associated with the UFOs, right? Channeling extraterrestrial civilizations, ancient alien belief, that kind of thing, as being marginal. But it's really not. Upward of 40% of Americans believe that extraterrestrials have visited our planet. Um, a majority of Americans believe in ghosts and in psychic powers and in what is broadly called by believers in this sort of thing the phenomenon. Um, these people go to school with us, they go to the grocery store with us, they are driving next to you on the street whenever you get in the car, right? They are making electoral decisions just as much as people who are not making who don't believe in UFOs are. And their belief in UFOs, just as with Betty and Barney Hill, shapes a great deal about the decisions they make about American politics and society, right? UFOs are central to the political life and cultural life of America in the last 100 years, whether or not we would like that to be the case or not. And the Hill story, I hope, tells in small form how this one couple's belief in these things begins to shape their decisions about broader issues of politics and society and culture.
You certainly have me convinced. I mean, it is something that I think that I coming to even as someone who is interested in many cases in kind of the new age, did not necessarily think of the cultural moment of alien encounters as being as significant as it was. Something that comes up early on in the book and throughout the book really is the question of the sort of the military industrial complex, or the fantasy and the reality of a certain kind of institution, post-war American institution, and its relationship more broadly to the idea of institutions, including the quote unquote scientific establishment. I was wondering if you could sort of set the scene a little bit in terms of at the time of this encounter, what's going on in America in terms of how people are feeling about institutions, how Betty and Barney Hill might themselves have been feeling about the idea of the institution, and how some of those anxieties play out in their story.
Yeah. It is, I think, almost impossible for those of us who grew up or who live in a country post Watergate, post Vietnam, to imagine what it was like living in the United States in the mid 20th century. And there are a series of Gallup polls that I cite in the book taken in the late 1950s and early 1960s, which demonstrate that upward of 3/4 of Americans, for many, many years in this period, said regularly that they trusted the American government to do the right thing most or all of the time. Of course, that seems laughably naive to us today, but it does, I think, represent a world in which the state was largely trusted. And of course, this was in many ways the product of the Second World War, the product of the New Deal, and the product of the Cold War. But at the same time as this was happening, there were small signs of fragmentation in that faith. It's hard to know for certain because Gallup did not break out their polls in as great detail as we would like, but my suspicion is that a fair chunk of people who said they did not trust the government to do the right thing most or all of the time were African Americans, like Barney Hill, who of course were living under a Jim Crow regime at that point. And you can see, I think, the emerging Black freedom movement that begins in the mid 1950s in earnest as a blow, right, to that faith and to that trust. Another thing that was dealing blows to that faith was what we now call the military-industrial complex. And this was a phrase that was made popular, of all people, by Dwight Eisenhower in his farewell address as president in January 1961, only a few months before the Hill's encounter. And Eisenhower warned Americans in that address to be wary of the power of this thing he called the military-industrial complex. And what he meant by that was a nexus between the Pentagon, between the US military, and between private contractors who signed and continue to sign, right, gigantic contracts to supply the military with all sorts of things. And to that nexus, we might add a third leg. And that third leg is what Tara just called the scientific establishment. Right, this gets going in earnest in the mid 1940s as the state begins to pour a great deal of money into universities and into research think tanks. Now, of course, the best example of this is well, you all saw, I presume, or at least most of you saw the movie Oppenheimer, right? The Manhattan Project. And this massive funding. Oh, you really should. It's quite good. And this massive funding given, right, to the University of Chicago, to the University of California, Berkeley, to the Jet Propulsion Laboratories, right, close to me here in Southern California, right? These agencies begin to receive a massive amount of funding and continue to receive a massive amount of funding. And so these different kinds of institutions, right? Commercial institutions, companies like Boeing or Lockheed Martin or so on and so forth, research institutions like major universities and the US military then form this real nexus that supported each other. And relied upon each other and passed massive amounts of money backward and forward. And it is, I think, astonishing, I think, for us to recognize how much of a new thing this was in the 40s and 50s, how vast the power of the American state and these non-governmental agencies supporting the state became in this period. And then it is both, or should not be, not surprising that the military took a great interest in UFOs in the 1940s through the 1960s and began researching them. And then consequently, as declining trust in government began to accelerate in the 1960s and 70s, doubt about what the military was doing with UFOs began to accelerate as well. This is, I think, in an important way in which UFO belief contributed to this growing suspicion of government that emerges by the end of the 20th century and begins to fuel the conspiratorialism that has taken control of our politics in the last 20 or 30 years.
There's so many follow-ups I want to ask you about, but I don't want to get too close to the present just yet. So I'm going to put a pin into my questions about the development of the military-industrial complex on the stack, the military-industrial complex, and the internet more later. But I want to go back to actually the question, one of the sort of tensions you brought up earlier in your response, which is the tension of race. So one of the most, I thought, interesting or unexpected as a reader, sort of elements of Betty and Barney's story is the way in which these two people have sort of very similar accounts of what happened, but very different emotional responses to, and let's say, atmospheres in their story. Betty, a white woman, importantly for the background, sort of has this sense of both excitement about these figures, but also seems more at ease with the seeming outlandishness of her story. Barney both views these mysterious figures that in his memories of them with more trepidation and fear, and also seems to be negotiating kind of tensions of respectability when talking about these things that many people would think not perhaps respectable, at least from a scientific, whatever that means, perspective. So where does this sort of the question of racial politics in America intersect with this story that you're telling about UFOs?
Yeah, absolutely. From the very beginning, Barney was always more hesitant about this story, this encounter, going public with it. They see this craft, or we might call it initially, as they did, simply a light, as Betty put it, a light that fell upward. They see this light the night of September 19th, 1961, as they are driving back to their home in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And Betty immediately is fascinated. She wants to watch it. She wants to pull over to the side of the road to follow it. Barney is more dismissive of it. Even then, he says, that's nothing, we should keep driving. Eventually, Betty says to him, and this is one of the questions I found in their interview transcripts that just fascinated me. Betty says to him, now do you believe in flying saucers? And Barney says, having just seen this strange light that followed them down the road for quite a long time, Barney says, don't be ridiculous, there's no such thing as flying saucers. And in that answer, I think there is so much weight. Later, the next day, Betty wants to call the U.S. military to report this craft that they saw. She's all gung-ho about this, and Barney does not want to. He tells her he is worried that they won't be taken seriously, that they will be laughed at. This continues for the next few years through the hypnosis that they undergo a few years later, in which they recover memories of much more kind of dramatic experiences with this craft. Barney's memories are deeply racially tinged. He describes the creatures that they saw with racial similes. He describes one of them as looking like an Irishman. He describes another as looking like a Nazi. He does not actually describe their features, right? He simply says they remind him of something. They remind him of this, they remind him of that. And of course, all of these recollections are racially tinged. This is much less the case for Betty, who finds these creatures much more intriguing. She describes having long conversations with them. And there is a real, I think, optimism on Betty's part. Optimism in all sorts of ways, right? Optimism that these creatures will take her seriously. They will provide her with fascinating and useful information. Optimism that science will be able to figure out what these creatures are and establish relationships with them. On Barney's part, though, there is always pessimism, fear, anxiety, worry about being captured, worry about being persecuted. And that comes, I think, from a couple of different sources. Consciously, he is telling Betty, we don't want to be taken as fools. We don't want to be seen as ignorant, right? And that, I think, is deeply wound in with his work in the civil rights movement. Both he and Betty were members of the Portsmouth National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which before the 1950s is the most important civil rights organization in the United States. And the NAACP's mission is very much one of racial uplift and integration. It is founded by W.B. Du Bois, right, the great Black intellectual who famously wrote about the talented tenth in the early 20th century, arguing that African Americans should gain education, should enter the economy, should become respected leaders in society as a way to gain increased respect and racial integration. That's something that Barney really deeply believes in. And so, of course, he views UFOs as something that would distract from that mission. That's in part due, I think, to a kind of coordinated campaign by the military-industrial complex to debunk UFOs, but nonetheless, it is true for him that he is always worried about this in a way that Betty is not. He is a pessimist where she is an optimist, frankly, because in many ways, I think he had more to lose.
I'm trying to decide whether I ask follow-ups now or later, but I am conscious that I have far too many things to ask you. So the other sort of strand of this is religion. And I was sort of reminded you're in elements of your book and another book, Robert P. Jones's The End of Right Christian America, which came out, I want to say in 2017, which details the sort of presents us with this hypothetical, in some ways, vision of, the Main Street American Christianity, deeply white and deeply sort of racially segregated. Sort of, there's the famous Martin Luther King Jr. Sort of statement that the most segregated hour in America is 11 o'clock on a Sunday morning. And yet Betty and Barney are, at least sort of at the time that the story is happening, they're Unitarians, and they're part of a kind of a movement or a group that is in dialogue with some of this sort of institutional Christianity at the time, but is also perhaps orthogonal to that. Can you talk about both the broader religious background of the time, and particularly about where Unitarians fit into all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important, I think, to note that Betty and Barney become Unitarians, right? They join the Unitarian Church shortly after their marriage, largely because they perceive it as hospitable. Hospitable both to them as a biracial couple, but also hospitable to their kind of general orientation in the world. Unitarianism is extraordinarily optimistic in the immediate post-war years. They are a faith that then and now presents itself as being highly sympathetic to and in dialogue with reason and rationality and science and technology. There's if you flip open the Register, which is the Unitarians main journal in 1950s and 1960s, you will find dozens of articles saying, Unitarians embrace reason. Unitarians are the faith of the post-war world, are the faith of this kind of scientific age. And Betty and Barney believed in that too, right? They believed in reason. They believed in conscious reform. They thought the world could be fixed, right? And it was their responsibility as rational, patriotic Americans to do that. The Unitarians are massively optimistic that they are going to explode in membership. They're a quite small denomination at this point, under 1 million members nationwide, but they are talking as though they're going to be the faith of the 21st century. So there's a real optimism there. And of course, this is a time, right, the 40s and 50s particularly, when institutional Christianity in America is really gaining ground. As of 1960, about 75% of Americans also said they attended a church or a synagogue every Sunday. That is an all-time high. That's far higher than 19th century American participation in denominations. It's far higher than today, right? And of course, Betty and Barney and many other Americans don't know that this is all going to start coming unraveled over the next 10 years or so. And in part, right, the Unitarian struggle comes apart because of our previous topic, which is race. Right, Unitarians are very progressive. They want to be racially integrated. They're trying very, very hard to do that, but in ways that do not quite click with many African Americans. I think this is largely true of many progressive white people today too, who tend to be really highly educated, right? And so you'll find letters that Unitarians are writing to each other as they make this really concerted effort in the late 1950s to reach out and gain more Black members. And so there were Unitarian congregations saying that they sent letters to local Black colleges asking if any of the faculty want to become Unitarians. Right, and so they're reaching out, right, to people whom they, in some ways, right, consider to be their own sort of people, which does not gain them much ground. It is, for Barney at least, it is his local congregation's commitment to civil rights that really gets him on board.
And what I'm fascinated by how you see Unitarianism as being kind of a piece with or not of a piece with some of the more sort of seeker-centric, intuitive ideology that we see, or I would argue we see in New Age spirituality. The idea that, a distrust of authority, a sense that the truth can be found within, that dogmas and other forms of sort of external stricture are to be mistrusted. And something that sort of strikes me about this story and this shift that I sort of am inviting you to tell us more about
Sure.
is sort of, where do Unitarians fit on the, if we're going to make a spectrum with the, traditionalist Catholics on one end and the most intense New Age make your own religion on the other. Is Unitarianism a kind of step along the way? Does it end up losing ground to the New Age precisely because those sort of qualities of hospitality and a certain kind of progressive mentality are being taken on by even, let's say, in even more extreme form by some of these New Age movements? I guess the short version of this question: how does Unitarianism fit into the New Age shift to come, and what does that shift look like from your perspective?
Yeah, those are two big questions, but fun ones. So let's see. So one thing that really took me a bit by surprise as I was working on this book was running across evidence that one of the first people that Betty and Barney Hill went to with their initial story, that is, we were driving home late this night, a light began to follow us, etc., was their minister, who was a guy named John Papandrew, educated at Harvard, who was really very much a civil rights crusader. They were close to him. They had been involved with his work for quite a while. And they tell him about seeing a UFO. And he says, that's fascinating. Why don't we have a discussion night and talk about it? And this wasn't the only time, which I think is really interesting. Throughout the 1950s, which is in some ways the kind of golden age of the UFO in America, UFOs have become very popular in American culture beginning in the late 1940s as the media seized upon this idea. You see a lot of Unitarian congregations taking up this question. Having discussion nights, book groups, inviting UFO speakers. And I suspect much of that is due to the fact that in the 1950s and early 1960s, the UFO is largely considered a scientific problem. That is, it is something that the Air Force is investigating. It is something that the American scientific establishment is interested in. Now, throughout the late 50s into the 1960s, there is a battle waged in the American popular mind as to whether or not that is the case. Increasingly, the federal government decides that UFOs are not scientific. They're not a scientific problem, they're a psychological problem. They are not actually craft to be explored. They're not things that we can understand by examining with scientific tools. Rather, they are the fruit of minds that are confused, minds that are troubled, minds that are paranoid. And so we need to then delegitimate the UFO as a topic of scientific inquiry. This is where the fight starts, because just as that is happening, as the American scientific establishment is moving away from taking UFOs seriously, many UFO believers insisted and continue to insist that in fact UFOs are scientific, and it's the government that is dropping the ball here. And that you see with that divide, that cleaving, increasingly between Unitarianism as a denomination and the emerging UFO movement, the same problem. Right? Unitarians still, and through the 70s and 80s, wanted to present themselves as scientific, but also as respectable. Right? Also as a denomination of people who have their feet on the ground, who are not out there wandering with their heads in the clouds, who are interested in reason and rationality, and as topics like UFOs, and later on channeling and psychic healing and automatic writing and so on and so forth. As people begin to advocate for these things as scientific, just as a scientific establishment is saying they are not scientific, Unitarians begin to abandon them. And people like the Hills are kind of caught in that tug of war.
This leads me very neatly into my next question, which is about pseudoscience, or the idea of pseudoscience. Something that I've always found fascinating about, like, and maybe I'm overstating the case here, but this a distinctly American phenomenon seems to be the way in which each sort of wave of scientific discovery in the 19th century and the 20th century gets sort of spiritualized, the existence of popular science as a kind of discourse where I'm thinking, for example, of the language electricity and magnetism being applied in new thought settings, for example, where there's a sense of, there's this, or it perhaps an even better known example, social Darwinism as this kind of corollary to like Darwinian evolution, that every time that there's some new scientific piece of information out there, there's a kind of wider, often moralized or spiritualized cultural fascination with it. At the same time, in your book, I think you make very cogently the case that to talk about pseudoscience is to make certain decisions about legitimacy and what is and is not scientific that ought not to be taken for granted. It's not necessarily obvious what falls into the science camp and the pseudoscience camp. And so I'm curious how we talk about what sort of I would have easily, before reading your book, referred to as pseudoscience, without falling into the trap of the military industrial complex, say, or like what is the role of what is popularly called pseudoscience in American cultural life, and what are some of the political questions at play there?
Yeah, that is such a naughty and good question. And I think if there's anything maybe that I would hope people would take away from the book is exactly what you just said, which is to say, let's think about using the term before we just use it, right? I think, and I'm drawing on here, I should credit the historian of science, Michael Gordon, who's written a number of really good books on this question of pseudoscience, and who argues, right, that the term pseudoscience has more to do with politics, and I mean not partisan politics per se, right, but power, and who has power, who is respected, who is not, who is in the mainstream and who is not, than it does with actual method. We could easily point to, right, periods of American life in which the entire scientific establishment considered things like eugenics scientific, right? And now eugenics is not scientific. It has become pseudoscience. So my takeaway is that the best way to kind of think about pseudoscience is that which the authorities whom are popularly respected in any given society as the arbiters of science deem pseudoscience. Now, the tricky thing is, as you point out, right, is in the United States since the 1960s, that has been largely this military industrial scientific complex, right? And of course, people who are labeled as pseudoscientific find a lot suspicious about that. And my uncomfortable conclusion is that perhaps they're not always wrong to be uncomfortable with that, right? To find that those people who have the cultural authority to deem something pseudoscientific are also themselves a group of people with agendas, with politics, with ideas about power and who should have the power and who should not, right? So it is not an easily resolvable question in which there is obviously a correct side and obviously an incorrect side. Rather, it is a question, I think, that should make us come up short every time we see that label pseudoscience and think, right, who is invested in labeling this as pseudoscience? By what metrics is it called this? And be sure that we are comfortable with all those decisions before we move on to simply accept the term.
Yeah, absolutely. And I find myself both very convinced by that, and to the point where, you've completely got me there. And yet, if I do want to not so much push back, but try and sort of tease out a particular clarification, which is there is a do you think there is something distinctly American about, let's say, let's call it spiritualized science, or like let's some alternate term for the purposes of discussion to talk about magnetism, new thought, the kind of the distinct way in which moral and spiritual ideas get loaded with scientific terminology in popular discourse. And I think like contemporary examples might be like a lot of wellness culture works along these
Sure.
lines.
Crystals, that kind of
Sure.
thing. Pyramids.
Um, Without putting the label pseudoscience on it for
Right.
now, um, how do how do we see that? A, is this distinctly American, and if so, why? And B, how do we talk about and think about what that is doing culturally for us, and has done culturally for us since, I would date it at least the 19th century, and perhaps one could
Yeah,
date it earlier.
absolutely. Um, hmm. To say, is this distinctly American? I think there's two parts to that. One is that is genealogically or historically. And I would say there, no, right? I think a lot of this work has to do and grows out of the real intertwining and in some ways, indistinguishable nature of what we would today call magic and science in the European tradition, right? Of course, like, famously, right, Isaac Newton was an alchemist. And when you go back into the genealogy of science in the West, right, you will find often that things we would now call pseudoscience or even magic, right, are really wound in to this. And that's always been the case, right? And this again speaks to science as being a category that's inherently political as opposed to merely methodological. However, second part there is, I think, a sense in which this kind of thing has taken on a distinctly American cast. And that is particularly in the last 60 or 70 or 80 years, it has been seized upon by American consumer capitalism. And if you were to ask me, why did the New Age happen in the United States when it did, I think that is a major reason, is because publishers suddenly begin printing so many of these books in the 1970s. Right, there are companies that put out your own neo-pagan kits that you can buy on Amazon, everything you need to become a witch for $49, right? Stuff like that, which is really, I think, a major engine behind the rise of the New Age in the 20th century United States. And finally, to put a pin in that, much of that rhetoric, much of the advertising even that promotes these sorts of books, the sort of selling of the New Age, draws on the language of science because the language of science is legitimating. It is authoritative. If you call something scientific, people are more inclined to pay attention. People are more inclined, perhaps, to purchase supplements or essential oils when there is somebody in a white lab coat saying this is scientific, even if, right, people at Berkeley might say, no, that's pseudoscience. So this fight, right, continues, but the existence of the fight, right, means that the New Age gains a lot of ground in the United States in the around the popular culture.
That's fascinating, and certainly, there is something kind of the intersection of the magic image, the scientific image, and the advertisement is something that does seem so distinctly American. I often when I teach from self-made, one of the examples I give is there's this 1928 series of advertisements for a correspondence course on personal magnetism, which is just sort of a charisma, and like there's multiple advertisements for it depending on what magazines you're reading, and some of them are like men in lab coats, you
Yeah,
know, saying like scientifically proven, and some of the ads for the same thing are, you know, slightly dubious Orientalist fortune tellers looking spooky and magic.
yeah,
But
next to each other,
yeah, and
right?
exactly, and it's like,
Yeah.
well, you know, it's magic and it's science, and you should buy it.
Mhm. Which is, that's 19th century spiritualism to a T, right? Spiritualists did not think they were doing something supernatural or weird. They thought channeling, mediums, seances, all of this was measurable scientifically. They insisted that they were doing science. Now, of course, today we don't think so, right? But at the time, were they? Most people thought yes.
And I suppose, and even hearing you talk now, I'm thinking now, and this is particularly catnip to me. My next book is on sort of the history of Western esotericism and
Oh,
modernity and
excellent.
technology. So there is something about the kind of the 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 scientist as wizard or mage being kind of countercultural or outside of its institutional authority when the institutional
Mm,
authority is the church, especially the Catholic Church.
precisely, right?
And then suddenly now the scientist, the idea of the scientist, the wizard, the mage, the scientist is part of the authority. And that is a kind of
Yes.
distinctly like it is a shift that I don't think I had myself thought of as clearly before
Mhm.
this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's representative, I think, of the ways in which American culture has changed over the years, and particularly I mean, perceived. We're not a secular country by in any sense of the word, right? But our perceived secularity has to do with science, which is understood to be orthodox, mainstream, boring, square. Right. So whereas 200 years ago, the scientist was the radical, was the interesting person who you could trust, now the scientist is not, right? The scientist is part of the establishment.
So I have a couple more questions before we open it to the floor. So just a bit of housekeeping. Um, for those of you who are listening, do start feeling free to drop questions into the chat over the next 15 or so minutes, or the next two or so questions, however long that takes. That's helpful to me, so I can get a sense of some of the questions on deck. And then what will happen next is we'll start by addressing questions from the chat, and then invite those of you who wish to ask questions directly over Zoom. So you can do both. You can do neither, but I encourage you to do at least one. But please don't feel like you have to wait for the right moment. Whenever you think of it, just feel to drop it in the chat, and I'll be looking at it in a little while. So before we move to the present day, I do want to talk a little bit about hypnosis and recovered memories, precisely because I mean, I think it's something now so closely linked with a sort of different set of questions of pseudoscience and the New Age, which is the sort of recovered memories and panic, the satanic panic over child sexual abuse in daycare centers with for those of you who are not familiar, basically a sort of mass hysteria over the secret occultists in daycares, and often using sort of hypnosis and recovered memories in with children to kind of create these accusations and what is often been called a modern day witch hunt. So I'm curious about where the role that hypnosis and recovered memories play in the Hills story, and also more broadly, uh, what that kind of where that goes, and whether there is sort of support for, or does this move the needle towards a sort of psychological interpretation of what's going on? And if so, what are the cultural anxieties as well as the sort of individual anxieties that are being played out here through the question of recovered memories and hypnosis?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, this really is a good follow-up to what we were just talking about, because the first thing I think we need to understand here is how hypnosis was perceived in the mid-20th century. And in part because of hysteria over the Korean War and what was happening in the Korean War with quote unquote brainwashing, and in part because of just the depictions of hypnosis in popular media, many Americans thought, and the Hills were among them, that hypnosis was cleanly scientific, that it was purely scientific, that the human brain was like a computer, and hypnosis was simply accessing the memory files right in that computer, that this all worked very simply and very easily, and was part of this general sort of awe and reverence for science that is emerging in the mid 20th century. Now, of course, even at the time, there were many psychiatrists and psychologists who were screaming to hit the brakes on this, that hypnosis was not nearly so simple and reliable, and that the human mind was not nearly so simple and reliable as a lot of these depictions of hypnosis presumed it to be. That really, you'll see a lot of analogies between the human brain and a machine in the mid 20th century, right? And you just push the right buttons, throw the right switches, you can make anything happen that you want to happen. That's simply not the case, right? But the Hills thought that it was. In part, I think that is because they were Unitarians, and they were absorbing this way of thinking about science and really the human mind from Unitarianism that was very kind of a brightly lit, clean, easily controllable space. So when they go to the psychiatrist, a man named Benjamin Simon, who was very widely respected, who had done a lot of work and is one of the kind of founding figures in the treatment of PTSD in the military, and who was among the national kind of authorities on hypnosis. He told them this wasn't true. He told them that hypnosis will not access actual memories, it will access emotional memories. You will remember things that might reflect legitimately how you are feeling now, how you might be feeling then, but do not expect to have your memory simply unfolded before you like watching a movie. And so, after 3 months of treatment, when the Hills came out of this with memories of being abducted by aliens and having medical experiments performed on them and so on and so forth, Benjamin Simon, their hypnotist, told them this simply isn't true. This did not happen. And Simon speculated that what they were actually remembering was some perhaps racial trauma that they had feared or had experienced while on this trip. And they had kind of clothed that fear of persecution, that fear of attack in this sort of story of an alien. The Hills really rebelled against that. They told him that he was being arrogant. They said, how can you tell us that the things we remember actually did not happen? And to be fair to the Hills, he was rather patronizing to them and paternalistic. And he told them essentially, I'm the expert, you're not, sit down and listen to me. And when they didn't, he washed their hands of them. I found a letter that he later wrote to a UFO debunker in which he says that when the Hills later became famous for this story and went on all sorts of talk shows and got a book published and so on, he said, I did not want to engage them in public because they are not simply equipped to talk about science the same way I am. And it would feel like punching down, essentially. They are ignorant, more or less. And that, that kind of attitude he had towards them did not help resolve these problems that they were having. But more or less, Betty and Barney kind of went to the grave believing that recovered memory was real, recovered memory was genuine. And the fact that their story was publicized in a book written in 1966 by a journalist who treated recovered memory in the same way, and then later on in a movie and in all the publicity they got, I think really contributed to this popular perception of hypnosis as something really powerful and really essentially scientific, and this way of thinking about the human mind as, you know, a bunch of cubby holes, and you just have to go back there and pull your memories off the shelf because they're sitting there waiting to be recovered, which most psychiatrists will tell you now is simply not the case.
Which brings us to actually the last question that I have, which is about the last, it's a multi-part question. So the last theme, which is sort of getting us to the present day, and through it, one of the things that sort of came up is implicit in your book, although you sort of don't talk about it explicitly, is that there is a kind of fourth leg, so to speak, of the military industrial complex, and that is the kind of computing work that is being done, or research into like what would become networked computing, and the kind of the version of what would become the internet that begins as something that is within the establishment, that is sort of scientific in a certain way, and kind of morphs by the time through the counterculture and by the present day into something very different. And I mean, I think it would probably be, slightly too on the nose to draw a parallel of like the invention of the internet and the new age as being these sort of similar kind of movements, but I'm curious about, in a contemporary landscape where reality feels particularly fungible, where perhaps is not a very academic way to put it, there's a lot of weirdness out there on the internet.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah.
just, the not just the popularity of occultism or witchcraft or witch talk or manifesting or what have you, but there is a sort of, the contemporary internet, to my mind at least, is a much more kind of spiritualized place than it is a scientific one. And I'm
Mhm.
curious how these questions of authority, of reality, of the authority of the self and our own experience versus that of some imagined other, particularly on post COVID. Um, what are we seeing now? And how can we draw a genealogy between sort of the contemporary language of establishment information, disinformation, and the kind of questions that were being asked in the 60s as a result of Betty and Barney's story?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. And forgive me if I start with Betty and Barney again, because I think one aspect of what you're talking about here we do see in their story, which is to say, right, after they felt dismissed by the military, after they felt dismissed by Benjamin Simon, they began seeking out people who would accept them and who would validate them and who would tell them their story was real. And in the late 1960s and early 1970s, that took the form, right, of people writing letters to each other, of the emergence of this wonderful term that J. Allen Hynek, who was one of the leading UFO researchers of the 20th century, called the Invisible College, and by which he meant, right, all of these researchers into what they called the phenomenon, that being UFOs and all the things associated with it, but who kind of tried to stay out of the way or out of the lens of the establishment because they knew they wouldn't be taken seriously. The New Age, it's not really you can't call the New Age a religion. You can't even really call it a movement because there isn't, right, a kind of self-conscious organization here. What it is a network. What it is a milieu, right? It's a territory of people who talk to each other, who form relationships. And this was going on in the 60s and 70s. And I think to the internet, right, what the internet has done is two things. First, it has vastly accelerated those networks. It has vastly enabled those networks. There is a political scientist named Michael Barkun who works on conspiracy theory. And Barkun argues that the emergence of the modern media system, beginning even with simply the publication of books 500 years ago, but up to the internet, as the modern media has facilitated greater interconnection and greater communication, we see the emergence of what he calls hyper-conspiracy, and what some other folks have called conspirituality, which is a term you might be familiar with, right? This idea that these once discrete conspiracy theories, these once discrete spiritual practices are increasingly being wound and woven into each other. So you might have been in the early 20th century, say, a medium, right? Someone who would practice telekinesis and who might channel an Indian guide, right? As they often talked about in the early 20th century. If you are that same person in the early 21st century, you will not only be doing your telekinesis and your channeling, but you will also have opinions on the reptilians. You will also find ways to wind in the Venusians into your story. You will have relevant ideas about pyramids and how to use pyramids, because this information network has accelerated to the degree that it's becoming simply one great blob of, to use your word, Tara, one great blob of weird that's all related to each other. No longer discrete, right? But deeply, deeply connected.
And just a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who have not yet asked a question in the chat. I just haven't seen any yet. Please feel free to do so. Otherwise, this will be our last question before the mics are on you. If you do want to ask a question over the mic, you can raise your hand, or you can just shout and be adults about, if two people shout at the same time. Just we're all grown-ups here. But if you'd like to raise your hand, I moderate however you want to ask those questions. So I want to, I guess, ask about COVID and the way that it the way in which we kind of saw in hyper real time the science become something that was both politicized and constantly changing. And the role of, regardless of where you started out on the political spectrum, of our kind of collective experience of watching science morph before our eyes, what the kind of lasting effects of that might be for public trust in the science, and what that means for our political life and our religious or spiritual life.
Yeah, so two things there. One thing, on the one hand, I think we saw with the emerging kind of national, the military industrial response to COVID, right, which includes the CDC, which includes all these universities, the people who produced the vaccine, the fact, right, that science is never one thing, which is to say, right, their advice, their guidance, their diagnoses evolved over time. So when people said, I trust the science, what that should be taken to mean, I think, is not simply, I trust this piece of information, right? Rather is, I trust this method, I trust this establishment, I trust the people pursuing this. But then on the flip side, right, on the kind of conspiratorial side, those people who have felt marginalized by that establishment, who have been called pseudoscience, would seize upon that evolution to label what is going on in the institution as pseudoscience, right? And to argue that we actually possess the real science, the genuine science. And you'll note, right, that these conspiratorial people use a lot of the same rhetoric, that is, of transparency and accuracy and experimentation, right, to call themselves scientific. I think one of the results of COVID is, to refer back to Barkun and this notion of kind of the emergence of linked hyper-conspiracies, right, is that we saw here this new group of conspiracy-minded people, anti-vaxxers, right, people with suspicions about vaccines, get connected to a lot of other scientific conspiracy people. And so you would see a lot of anti-vaxxers then starting to tout traditional, psychic healing, right? And start to tout things like essential oils, right? And start to tout all of these alternative healing remedies that other groups have been working on for quite a long time. And the networking, I think, that was going on there in these often online, but increasingly in-person spaces, I think, is really fascinating, and one of the most powerful ways in which we see the politics of science changing in real time.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matt. So I hopefully will be done asking you
Mhm.
questions, assuming all of you do. So our first question in the chat is from Marshall. So Marshall asks, with the caveat that it might be beyond the scope of the work, but do you take a view, Matt, on to what extent science and pseudoscience do map in practice to methods? Or perhaps put another way, he says, even if they serve political purposes, do they or do they not have a high incidence of accuracy at the current time?
Yeah. So that is an excellent question, and goes. I think I'm going to be leaning on Michael. Not. I'm sorry, Michael Gordon here, who has written a lot about this, and he says, right, the one major way we can make distinctions between science and pseudoscience is the presence of community. That is why, while pseudoscientists might argue, right, that they are following experimental methods, the same sort of kind of quote unquote scientific method that we all use in grade school, a major distinction today is that pseudoscience does not generally participate in the politics of peer review and kind of correlation and yeah, I stumbled over that word. Essentially, their experiments are not replicated, right, by others who then test them. And that then leads on the back end, right, to people who are advocates of mainstream science and the idea of mainstream science arguing that our stuff actually works. And that is indeed the case often because it does go through those methods of experimentation and also peer review that pseudoscience does not. So many advocates for pseudoscience today will argue that they are using the forms of science, experimentation, control groups, so on and so forth, but they'll have one experiment and then say, aha, here are my results, and go out into the world with it and say, what I have done is scientific, without right having that testing by other groups, by their peers, right, without running it by their peers over and over and over again.
In which case, the Marshall says makes sense. Great, so fabulous. Opening up the floor then. Other questions from any of you?
Could you comment on whether these alien sightings, these sightings of UFOs, appear to lead to a happy, healthy life, or did they appear to lead to disaster for the people that saw UFOs? I mean, in other words, overall, if you were living in the 50s and you could either hope that your friends saw UFOs or didn't see a UFO, which of those two do you think led to a happier outcome?
That is a great question, and it goes right to the heart of a debate that is happening in the UFO community even up to today. There are many people, and I'm thinking here of a group that's often called the contactees, going back to the 1950s, people like George Adamski and George Van Tassel, up to Rail, the founder of the Raelians, who are often in the news today. And going, I think, to the most respected advocate for this point of view is John Mack, who was a professor of psychology at Harvard, who wrote a book called Abduction in the 1990s. These people argue that UFOs, and to acknowledge this, they acknowledge that UFOs are real, that there is some sort of other intelligence seeking to contact us, but they want to contact us for our good, to benefit humanity. In the 1950s, people were saying they're trying to contact us to end nuclear war, for instance, to promote peace. Much later, by the late 20th century, people like John Mack are arguing that the alien encounters that they studied, the abductees that they visited, tended to have a sort of renewed sense of optimism and hope. That their interactions with these intelligences, whatever they were, gave them grounds for believing that a better world was possible and that it was possible to solve human problems and so on and so forth. Now, on the other hand, there is also a group, and I would put Betty and Barney Hill here, leading up into the 80s and 90s with people like Bud Hopkins, David Jacobs, and Whitley Strieber, who wrote the really, really famous book Communion, who argue for the opposite. They say that these intelligences are hostile, And you see a lot of conspiracies emerging out of this. A lot of these people say that the aliens are coming to colonize Earth, that they're going to eliminate human life, take over our planet, and so on and so forth. And what is interesting is that the people who encounter aliens who were interviewed by David Jacobs or Bud Hopkins tended to come out of the experience traumatized and frightened. So in a sense, right now, of course, both of these groups say aliens are real. One group says they want our good. The other says they wish us ill. For me, as an academic, just looking at all of this, I would say this. And I say this about Betty and Barney Hill as well. I think they had an anomalous experience. I think they saw something strange in the sky. I don't think they were abducted. I think that was a product of recovered memory. But what was all important, I think, for Betty and Barney, and then also for these various other people I've talked about, is this. They had a strange experience. They went in hunt for experts who could help them understand what had happened to them. And I think so much depended on who they got in contact with. If you ended up in contact with somebody like John Mack, you might learn to interpret that experience in a way that was healing for you. If you ended up in contact with someone like David Jacobs, you would be told, right, this experience is a portent of doom. So as with so much else, right, all lies in the interpretation.
Ahmed, you've got a question?
I had a question, but I thought I could just add 2 cents to that response as well, if it's possible.
Yeah, go ahead.
So yeah, I'm someone who is just deeply atheist and just not interested in religion or even in the six aliens or anything like that. But it was a few years ago where I sort of had, I guess, a classic spiritual awakening. As Stanislav Grof talks about, all sorts of crazy experiences, including one which I interpreted to be a very alien one as well. And it was ontological shocking, right? It's like a whole upheaval of your whole underpinning of how you view the world and all that, because it wasn't just aliens. It's a matter of how you view life and death because of other experiences and just everything else that comes with it. And just, again, all the other experiences that come with it. An out-of-body experience where you wonder what the hell was that? All that sort of stuff. And again, as a guy who's not familiar with the literature at all, there might be people who have read this stuff growing up, but I just someone who just never had that interest, never, suddenly this all happens. And I think the first place my mind went to was a questioning of my own mental sanity, as opposed to actually giving legitimacy to these experiences that I faced. Why? Because I'm very much embedded in the more common worldview. That's what I grew up with. It's what I was a believer of. I had a very, very firm belief that once we pass away, nothing else happens. But then you have these other experiences where you're like, well, I can even verify this information. Now, is it replicable, like you mentioned? Maybe not. But the fact that I'm still getting a hit, it's still, again, still shocks your worldview. I think for me, it was one of those cases where, I was questioning my sanity. That's where my mind went to. But through all of that was also processing the event before I even talked to anyone. And I'll say that for me, it's actually a very deeply transformative, affair. It's one of that actually led me to a deeper love and care for all and empathy for all other forms of life, outside of just humans. Just look at little ants, and I just wonder deeply about their own lives and how they are and all that. But there's a whole lot there. But I was gonna say, so I think that plays a huge role. I think many times when you talk to people, because a huge part of my thing as well was getting myself medically checked out, being told I'm fine, even after you mentioned all these experiences. But again, just because of my deeply embedded worldviews, it still took a bit of time to actually accept it. And that came about, we're just talking about, sadly, the New Age movement, right? Where people who I just had this very huge aversion to, but I'm like, well, I can see that the grasp on the topic is unhealthy, but some of the things they talk about actually mimic the experiences I've had that I've never even heard about until they're telling me about it. And they're like, oh my God, that's exactly what happened to me. And when they mention their details, it mirrors up with the details I've had in that experience too, But one thing I see is it does matter on 2 things. One, how gripped up are you by the trauma of the unknown, right? Versus, well, how can you move beyond that to just accept the message or what other meaning there might be there in that experience? I think many people get stuck in that phase. And I think when you read again, the state of the internet right now, as you guys mentioned, you can find anything you want. So it's a case of, do you then go the David Jacobs route of seeing things about your experience, or do you then go the John Mack route? But I think even aside from that, if you can insulate yourself from that, you still could end up one way or the other. And I think one thing I see with a lot of people is think of the alien abduction as more of a shamanic affair, of a shamanic ritual, where you are going through this whole procedural pomp and circumstance of this event going on. There's this transformation. It might require, or it might have organs being taken out by these other things and cleansing, but at the end of the day, it didn't feel like an actual organ that was surgical procedure. Sure, you might gripped up on that, but if you look beyond that, you might recognize that, hey, there's actually this other transformation that actually took place. So that's one thing I see many people coming to as well.
Yeah.
But that wasn't my question.
Oh, no. I have stuff
Yeah.
to say to that, but if you want to ask a question, go for it, and then I'll circle back.
Oh, yeah, sure. I think my question was, first of all, I just want to say this is a great topic, and there's lots of things you mentioned at the very beginning that I think that, deserves this, just like more airtime or just like a deeper consideration. Like the fact that you're talking about the electorate believing in all these sort of fringe beliefs. We have presidents. Reagan had a psychic that he commonly kept, referring to. Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford both saw UFOs in the presence of other people. I think Jimmy Carter even saw a craft, not just a weird light, but a thing.
Yeah.
We talk about how there are many religious movements that people don't realize are UFO based. People think of aliens and Heaven's Gate, but Mormonism has a huge UFO component to it. The Nation of Islam, people think of as a social movement, but it's Louis Farrakhan going inside this chariot with these other beings in the sky and all that sort of stuff. But one question I had was, since you looked into the whole like Barney and Betty Hill, one thing I've always been fascinated by is that geographical area around that time had lots of other events happening as well. So I think like there was a whole bunch of Jack Parson followers that took over the town of Yarmouth, Maine. Francis Swan as well, the automatic writer, was also around that area too. The founder of NICAP, or one of the first few directors of NICAP, was around that area too. Can you tell us more as to what was going on around that area? Is there some sort of sociological change, or kind of as you were mentioning, is there a case of just, I guess, more of the underpinning beliefs behind Unitarianism? So more of the acceptance of the other and considering, that sort of like, those sort of beliefs that were more prevalent in that area. What happened in that area that caused all these movements in people?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And for those of you, right, who may not recall, they lived in Portsmouth, Maine, and they actually met Francis Swan at one point. She was an automatic writer; she could channel, and then wrote words that she said that these intelligences that were communicating with her gave her. She told Betty and Barney that they had met what she called, quote, the bad ones, and that they should stay away from their abduction. So they were worried about that. This was, I think, really important to them, that they were able to plug into this network that existed in this area of eastern New Hampshire, southern Maine at that time. They were really involved with a lot of these groups. There was a guy named Herbert Knowles, who I write about in the book, who lived just across the river in Kittery, Maine, from them, who was a real leader in NICAP and who was very, very involved in a lot of these movements, who invited them into their home and introduced them to many of these people. That's how they met Francis Swan. And they found then, I think, this kind of, as I was saying earlier, this network there that enabled them to not only, I think, feel validated, but also find ways, as you point out, to understand their experience in broader terms. One thing I think people who just know kind of casually about alien abduction or UFOs, right, they tend to think these are just people who get on a craft out there in Tau Ceti or wherever, and then they fly to Earth. But as Ahmed is saying, right, for many people, alien abduction is not just about another civilization that happens to exist. It is a broader phenomenon. And again, I mentioned that earlier, right? That's a word they often use that has to do not only with meeting another race of intelligent life, but also with kind of the nature of consciousness, the nature of our existence, what it means to be human. And there's a lot of arguments that civilizations on other planets flying here on metal ships is not actually the best way to understand UFOs or aliens. That in fact, what is happening here is a phenomenon that has to do with interdimensionality. right? That we're experiencing alternative levels of reality in these anomalies, that the lights in the sky are not spacecraft, but they are something kind of entering our dimension from a fourth or fifth or sixth dimension that we experience at our capacity to experience it, right? And if you think of it that way, this is what Ahmed said about ontological shock, right? Which is a word or a phrase that's gaining a lot of momentum right now. Yeah, it is something that really transforms how you understand the nature of reality, far more than if it were simply, right, someone in a spaceship flying here from another planet. The idea, right, that we are maybe on one rung of a ladder of intelligence and consciousness about the universe, and there are creatures beyond us that are interacting with us in some ways. Right, there are deep roots to this too, certainly, right? This is what Helena Blavatsky and the Theosophists were talking about in the 19th century, but even going back beyond them as well. It kind of plugs this notion of UFO encounters as simply kind of a current manifestation. And this is what a famous investigator named Jacques Vallée has argued, right? That it is a current manifestation in a society and a world that is obsessed with technology of something that's been going on for years and years and years, which is human interaction with intelligence of another kind, whether that be extraterrestrial or interdimensional or extra-dimensional or whatever your term might be. So thank you for that, Ahmed. That was a really kind of fascinating story. I'm glad to hear it.
So we've got Jenny and Mark followed by, or Jenny and or Mark followed by Diana.
Yeah, hi, thanks. This has been really interesting, really enjoying it. I have a question about some of the research on that's been done on this or hasn't been done on this. And it comes from a personal experience where years ago, I was in a car with a friend and it was in the Southern California area. And we saw a spectacular thing in the sky. It was lights and they were flashing and they were moving in a way that, I'd never seen before. And we both were awed by it. And on one hand, we said to each other, we've just seen a UFO. And on the other hand, I thought, I'm sure there's an explanation. Like that was my kind of emotional reaction. And sure enough, later on, I found out a report about some sort of malfunctioning satellite crashing. And so I told my friend that, and she said, oh, I don't believe that. Right. And it was interesting. And I don't know that this was a big deal to her ultimately in her life, but definitely it had never occurred to me not to believe the explanation. I assumed there was one. And I'm wondering if anyone has ever researched, because I'm sure that a lot of people see UFOs all the time, something in the sky that they don't know what it is. Yeah. And I'm wondering, has anybody researched, like, is there a certain type of life experience or personality or something that results in people experiencing it as a certain way? Like for one person, it might just be a passing interesting thing. And for another person, life-changing. So I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, no, that is a great question. And you're absolutely right? When people hear UFO, you just automatically think little green men. But of course, the phrase actually just means something flying that you cannot identify. And it might simply be a jet plane, right? Or it might be a spaceship from Tau Ceti. Who knows? But yeah, that question, I think, is really at the heart of this. And we could start with Carl Jung. Carl Jung wrote a small book called Flying Saucers, a Modern Myth of Things Seen in the Sky. And he argued, right, just that this thing in the sky might be whatever the viewer needs it to be. Because you don't know what it is, right? So you might simply say, oh, it's an airplane. Or you might say it's an extraterrestrial craft. And Jung believed that people who were more sensitive to the ways in which society is struggling, people who were concerned about, who did not perceive society to be a kind of unified and coherent and healthy whole, were more likely to see the gaps in American society and thus would be more likely to view this thing as something with significance, as something that might help, right, or might answer the reasons as to why society was broken down. Now, that's a very kind of, kind of classic early 20th century psychological way of looking at this, to be sure. But other people have followed up on that. Now, certainly during the Cold War, many government projects and government commission reports argued that people who interpreted things as UFOs were mentally damaged in some way. which is not quite what Jung was saying, right? Jung did not believe that these people were necessarily mentally damaged, but the Air Force did. And so the Air Force mounted a very, very massive campaign in the 1950s and 60s to discredit the idea of UFOs and to say, right, these things, belief in UFOs is associated with being on the fringe of society, having unhealthy fixations, suffering from schizophrenia or anxiety or neurosis. Right, so there was a real association that the government tried to plant in the popular mind, and this, I think, is one way in which the military-industrial complex has perhaps actually been kind of hostile to American citizens, right, by trying to persuade us that this class of citizens is unhealthy in some way. More recently, psychiatrists like John Mack have gone the other way, right? Mack argues that interpreting things as UFOs and believing things to be UFOs is actually a sign of spiritual hunger, and maybe a deep kind of desire to try to fix society. Now, this emerges in part, I think, from Mack's kind of predilection to see encounters with extraterrestrials as ultimately psychologically healthy. But he is there as well. There's even some more kind of recent folks. A current Harvard professor named Susan Clancy wrote a book called Abducted, in which she really delves into the psychological experience of abduction and argues actually that it probably stems from suffering from other psychological disorders like night terrors and things like that. So you could go either way, just depending on who you read. You could find reports going all directions there.
Diana, you're up.
Thank you.
Hi, Diana. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
So I've known Diana for several years, people, but I had no idea she would be on this. So good
Yeah,
to see
good to see you. And I'm currently, I live in, well, no longer work at Georgetown, but I still like live here as a resident minister.
Oh,
So
lovely.
I'm from Georgetown,
Mhm.
Your old home. So, yeah, I wanted to take this in kind of a practical direction in terms of the implications of just the vast sort of epistemological networks being formed around different epistemologies and methods of finding truth and figuring out what what reality is about, and that conversation about conspiracy theories and how the internet has done this, and basically just ask the question of, like, first of all, what becomes of traditional religion, and second, what are the possibilities, and are there any like glimmers of hope for public life? And I guess just give a little bit of context to shape the question a little bit. So when I was working at Georgetown full time, and I've since switched to some other things, I was in their multi-faith campus ministry. So I've been doing, in interreligious multi-faith spaces for so many years. And I just always got this sense of like, these communities are not doing what these interfaith dialogue models assume they're doing. Like increasing, these are still, there's spaces that are accomplishing a lot. But they're certainly not where everybody is just straightforwardly absorbing their beliefs about what's true. And Tara, your book Strange Rites was just such a I felt like I was looking for that for years, because I was like, finally, like, can we talk about the fact that any Muslim, Mormon, Catholic group has its Jordan Peterson people and its Brene Brown people, and like, just, I feel like that's where people are actually kind of forming their worldviews. And traditional religion, I'm not, I think to say it's dying is way too easy, though, you can say that it's doing something else now, and I'm curious about that. And then another observation is just as these networks of different people asking similar questions of reality kind of emerge on the internet, and these kind of disembodied spaces, there is this interesting way in which the sources of our worldviews, or the networks that hold them, are increasingly like scattered and dispersed. And though you might gather at a furry convention or your annual UFO thing in Roswell, New Mexico, or whatever it is, but they're mostly kind of dispersed and invisible. And the implications of that for public life are just quite interesting, right? Like, we have these I don't know, these old pictures of like, yeah, get to know your neighbors and people down the street, and as though like traversing physical distance is kind of what's required to get to know people of difference, people with ideological difference. And it just strikes me that we're kind of like, and even when people do have like visible symbols of things, for example, like, you know, dressing in a certain way that implies they're part of some kind of tribe, often they're like incomprehensible to people who are outside of that tribe, right? Like, you can be part of some fashion scene in New York, and if you're traveling in Iowa, like no one's going to know what you're doing there, you know? And so anyway, I'm just curious about the way that we're like, the actual sort of networks and communities are in kind of publicly invisible, often just incomprehensible to each other. Yeah, the observation that I don't know, traditional religion is still kind of there, but obviously doing something very different. And just like, what does this mean for public life? Obviously, we're seeing it means a lot of not great things.
Yeah.
Is there anything else to be said here about what's possible, or the way that we should be trying to approach the ideological diversity among us?
Yeah, that's that's a book itself, I think. But some thoughts. So first, to your first question about institutional traditional religion, I think much institutional religion, and I mean mostly here Christianity, right? But to some extent Judaism and Islam in the United States, has been really, really deeply marked and is in some ways handcuffed by the experience of the mid-20th century, which is right 40s through the 60s. This was a period of a massive institutional growth, and we've talked a bit about some of that institutional growth already, right? Not simply religions, but also government, universities, all of these traditional institutions of authority in society, and religion grew with them, right? Church membership spikes in that period. Ministers are on the cover of Time magazine, right? And because religion was then perceived as one institution among several large institutions that provided kind of cultural stability, provided a source of authority that was commonly accepted. You see a lot of interfaith work emerging in this period as well, right? The National Council of Catholics, Christians, Catholics, and Jews emerges at this time. Dialogue groups, right? The sense that all religions are basically the same. I think what many of these traditional denominations have been struggling with is the massive fall off in faith in institution and trust in institution has affected not just government, but religion, or even the universities, but religions as well. And religions, I don't think are really capable, or have not yet learned to perceive their problem of a loss of membership in that broader context of the fading of institution. So it's less anything in particular that the Roman Catholic Church in the United States is doing incorrectly than it is a kind of particular manifestation of a broad cultural trend. So that is to say, I think you're absolutely right to point out that many of these cultural authorities that people listen to now and seek out now are no longer these institutions. There are people like Jordan Peterson or Brene Brown, right? There are these books and movements and so on and so forth. So if institutional religion is to survive, I think it's going to have to pivot in some ways and start to imagine itself less as an institution that provides clarity and authority, and more kind of smaller, nimbler cultural manifestation that might have little to do with an institution generally. Which speaks, I think, to your second point, right? There is, I think, since the 1990s, people have been worrying about the fading of institution, that we're no longer a nation of joiners. We sit on the couch and watch TV. We get on the internet. All the way back to Bowling Alone, right? That kind of classic book of sociology from the mid-90s that mourns the fading of bowling leagues in America. I see, though, and I'm going to steal a little bit here from Strange Rights, the great book that Diana mentioned a moment ago that I've taught, which is how good I think it is. There actually is a lot going on here. It's not as though we're all just sitting on our couches not talking to anybody anymore. We do talk to people. We do interact with people in more ways than we ever had before, right? I think the interesting thing about this is that we are still in so many ways like 10-year-olds with the internet. I think a lot about something the Atlantic writer Derek Thompson said once, which is that about drinking. And what happened in the 19th century was that the technology behind alcohol got a whole lot better. And so you got just massively higher proof alcohol coming out throughout the 19th century, and everyone's freaking out because everyone's getting drunk all the time. And then gradually, by the 1920s, Prohibition happens, there are more controls on alcohol, and people start figuring out how to drink responsibly. But there was a period of 20, 30 years there when there was massive public drunkenness, and it was causing very real social problems. We tend to think that the Prohibition folks were just kind of weird scolds. That wasn't actually the case. Public drunkenness was a massive problem in the mid-19th century. We're in that same place. We've got social media on our phones now. We see like teenagers having massive crises of depression and anxiety caused by social media. But it's kind of like we're 12-year-olds drinking Jack Daniels. And we just haven't figured out as a society yet how we're going to kind of channel and control and contain this new thing called the internet. I hope that there will be some emerging social norms around it, as there were emerging with alcohol in the early 20th century. What those might look like yet, I don't know, but I do think there is a lot of really amazing, to borrow another sociological term, social kindling on the internet now. There's a lot of possibility for mobilizing people, for building communities. It's just a matter, I think, of figuring out how to make those communities more healthy than not. And I think that teeter-totter is a little unbalanced right now, but there is, I think, hope.